thank you, everybody. Thanks so much for joining me here today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And I'd like to start these talks by addressing the elephant in the room. I am a futurist, as Patricio pointed out, but I do not have a crystal ball. They did not issue me a crystal ball after graduating from futurist school. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to tell you exactly what the future is going to be. That's really not my job. My job is to help people think through possible ways in which the future could develop and then help them to develop strategic options for grappling with the future as it unfolds. So futurists cannot tell you the future. If you ever meet a futurist who says that they can, uh, you should go in the other direction. So just a disclaimer up front, Patricio was very gracious in introducing me, so I won't belabor this, but I do quite a lot of teaching. I teach futures thinking and foresight at a bunch of institutions around the world. I also work a lot inside of organizations, helping them to develop long-term visions for the future. And on the right side of the slide here, you'll see some of the organizations I've worked with most recently. And I do have a passion for working with startups. And what I want to focus on today in this talk is I want to reflect on some of the things that I've done in my career, specifically with startups in emerging technologies. And I want to try to extract some lessons that I've learned from working with these companies specifically about the user experience design challenge when you're working with emerging technologies. I think that there are unique challenges in user experience design in this sort of emerging technology space. And hopefully, as a discussion goes on today, you can learn a little bit about what I think those are, and we can have a fruitful discussion about how it can help you with some of your UX challenges or some of your marketing challenges or what have you. So I'll talk about two projects in particular. The first project is in the space of radical life extension. And this is a project I worked on early in my career. If you're not familiar with radical life extension, we could talk about what that is. And the second project is in the commercialization of neurotechnology, in particular, a technology called EEG. We will get into that. And you can see that this woman in the middle of the slide is wearing the product that I worked on. I'll tell you all about that. And then more recently, I have been working with several artificial intelligence startups. Obviously, you all know that this is a huge space right now, and there's just a lot of energy and search for value. So I want to offer some preliminary thoughts about where I think we may discover value in the AI space and how to kind of win in this space in such a crowded field. So again, hopefully you find this illuminating. So I'll give you a little bit of a primer about how I think about user experience, because I'm not a UX designer by trade. Again, I'm a futurist, but I have worked with a lot of UX professionals in my career. And I've come to the conclusion after working with a lot of these startups in emerging technology that UX is the most critical factor in deciding the adoption rate of emerging technologies. In other words, um, if you can have this incredible technology, it delivers significant value to people, but if they don't have a way to grapple with that technology, if they don't have a way to understand it, if there's not an intuitive way for them to enter into the dialogue with an emerging technology, they will not be able to discover that value, and they'll miss out on the value that these technologies can provide. So it's critical to get the UX right. And again, I think that there are unique challenges. I tend to think about UX as sort of like a layered onion. So at the root, I suppose the core of UX is the ergonomics and the user interface. This is like really the mechanical elements of a user interaction. Just how menus work, what the gesture controls are, and so on, right? So these are important and essential elements to user experience design. Then you have some of the emotional dynamics of the interaction. You could think about the emotive elements of social media platforms. The infinite scroll creates a kind of a compulsion. Being able to like or put a heart onto a post creates a little interactive emotional moment. So these are some of the emotional dynamics of user experience. And these are not what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about some broader considerations, and I think this is where we butt up against futurist thinking in user experience design. I'm sort of interested in how emerging technologies interact with what I call cultural considerations. So how do they challenge our societal norms, our values, and our expectations? And then perhaps even more broadly, how do emerging technologies challenge our moral frameworks? How do they create ethical puzzles for us to solve? How do they raise existential questions that we need to grapple with? So as a futurist working in the space of UX, I'm interested in these highlighted orange questions because I think getting them right is important for paving the way for emerging technologies to diffuse through culture. And it takes a long time for these things to happen, but it's important, again, I think, to get the basic elements right. So that's how I think about UX. And with that in mind, let's just jump straight into the first case study. And I'll start with a few questions for all of you. Unfortunately, I can't see any of you at the moment, but I'll just pose these questions to you and you sort of answer them for yourself. And I'm going to make some assumptions about how you might answer based on how this has gone with other audiences. So the first question is, would you use a product or service that added 10 healthy years to your lifespan? So just take a second to consider that question. And the second question is, would you use a product or service that added 100 healthy years to your lifespan? What about a product or service that added 1,000 healthy years to your lifespan? And finally, would you use a product or service that added an indefinite or limitless number of healthy years to your lifespan? So I have asked this question to many audiences in live settings. And what I do is I ask them to raise their hand if they would use the product. And then as the number of years increases in the question, that they lower their hand if they would no longer use that product. And typically what happens is almost everybody says that they would use the product that adds 10 healthy years to their lifespan. But when you start to talk about 100 years, 1,000 years, or an indefinite number of years, for some reason the product becomes a niche product. Fewer and fewer people say that they would use that. And when you ask people why they prefer one imaginary product, because none of these exist, of course, and not these other more radical products, they tell you that those products that are promising extraordinary numbers of years, they're unnatural, or that only selfish people would want to use them or live that long. Or they also say that they're worried that they would get bored living for that long. So what I take from this is that these imaginary products, these radical technologies, they kind of short circuit our current frame of thinking. They exceed the bounds of what is acceptable or normal. They're so far outside the normal rules that people don't know what to do with them, and products that promise more extraordinary value are less and less interesting. So with that in mind, I want to share with you a little bit about the life extension sector and the development of life extension technologies. So early in my career, I worked quite a lot in this space, and just to share with you how we kind of segmented it. So along the bottom of the slide, we have, let's say the average human lifespan in the developed world is around 85 years, give or take. Imagine we have this scale at the bottom, with the left side of the scale promising incremental increases to average lifespan, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. And on the right side of the scale, we have sort of compounding extensions to human lifespan. So 100 plus years, 250, 500, and 1,000. So on the left-hand side of this market segmentation, we have what you might call traditional or incremental life extension products. Some of these are going to be very familiar because we get Instagram ads for them all the time. Diet and supplementation, obviously, hormonal treatment. I think that this is an emerging space in the broader consumer marketplace for hormonal treatments. Gene therapies, cellular rejuvenation. These are more nascent spaces, but they are reaching the marketplace now, and there's some interesting claims being made. So those are traditional life extension products. Then you have what I call radical life extension products, and these are things that are pre-market. These are mostly in research and development, or we're still doing basic science and research in many of these things. So we have organ replacement, and by that I mean not organ donation, but growing organs from stem cells. bioengineering, cryonics and stasis technologies, nanotechnologies, that would be, basically unleashing floods of microscopic robots into your bloodstream to do on-site repairs to organs and so on. And then finally, mind uploading technologies. So these are all pre-market, they're all R&D efforts, but they are underway. And this is the space that I did some work in early in my career. And we'll talk about that in a second. But I just want to highlight one company that I think is so fascinating in this space. You may have heard of them. They're called Loyal. And Loyal, they are developing therapies, specifically life extension therapies, for extending the lives of large dog breeds. If there are dog lovers among us, you may know that large dog breeds, like the giant dogs, typically don't live as long as normal or small dog breeds. And so they're sometimes called heartbreak dogs for that reason. And so Loyalist is hoping to create therapies that would extend the life of these dogs in particular so that they have something closer to the average lifespan of regular sized dogs. So what I love about Loyal is that, first of all, the path to commercialization for canine therapeutics, for life extension therapeutics, is less stringent and less costly than conducting human trials, so that there are fewer hoops and regulations that you would encounter, and so you can bring things to market more expediently. Okay, and then secondly, if we normalize life extension therapeutics for our pets, and it is seen to be effective, it also paves the way for a broader cultural conversation about life extension in humans and the eventual normalization of life extension as a regular therapeutic process. So I just find that such an interesting approach that Loyal is taking, because the the founders of Loyal were primarily interested in human longevity, but I think they made the strategic choice to focus on dogs for the reasons that I just highlighted. And the lesson that I take from Loyal is that when you're working in emerging technologies, sometimes you need to go off road mapping. You need to go off the roadmap. What do I mean by that? I mean that even though the end state goal is human therapeutics for longevity, we need to take a detour. We need to go on a side quest in order to prime the market, to develop a sense of cultural sensitivity to life extension, and we need to wait, right? We need to wait it out. The worst thing to do would be to try too early to launch a product and for it to fail because the ground was not primed for it. So the roadmap is often long and winding. We need to ensure that we take our time. There's a much more prosaic example of this in the early days of e-commerce. When Jeff Bezos launched Amazon.com, some of us are probably old enough to remember that Amazon was initially a bookseller, and they didn't sell everything on the planet. And the reason that they were a bookseller was not primarily because Jeff Bezos loved books, even though that may have been true, and I think it is. The reason they were a bookseller is because books were easy to pack and ship because they were regular size. They were not strange and obliquely sized objects. And so from a shipping perspective, they were very easy to ship. And Jeff Bezos also recognized that people who buy books tend to also have a lot of discretionary income. And so getting them into the habit of e-commerce would bear fruit in the long term. So they were strategic choices. It was a strategic choice to become a bookseller. So I think there was something similar going on in that space, just to kind of give you a more well-known reference. So now let's talk a little bit about radical life extension. And again, I would ask for a show of hands, but I wonder if some of you are familiar with the space of cryonics. It's a very science fiction type of technology. And I want to tell you a little bit about cryonics right now, because this is, again, a space I spent some time in. So cryonics is the practice of preserving the deceased at extremely low temperatures with the hope that scientific and medical advancements in the future may allow them to be revived and potentially cured of the conditions that led to their death. So for instance, let's say, and this is the case for some of these services, somebody with a terminal diagnosis would opt to be euthanized and then cryopreserved, and then hope for a future in which there was a treatment for the disease. So what you're seeing here is footage from a facility called Alcor. This is, I believe, in the Southwest United States. Arizona, I believe, is where this is. Alcor has about 1,500 members, so those are people who've made full and contractual financial arrangements to be cryopreserved. They also have about 250 active patients, which is what Alcor calls the members that they have in cryostasis. You might be interested to learn that Alcor hosts several famous patients, including the baseball player Ted Williams, the neuroscientist Marvin Minsky, who passed just a few years ago, and a computer programmer named Hal Finney, who, again, some of you may know, is the odds-on favorite to be the person behind the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto, the inventor of Bitcoin. So by most people's assessment, because the person behind Bitcoin is not yet known, the founder of Bitcoin is probably stored in this facility. So, and you may have noticed these giant stainless steel silos in these videos, in this video. These are called dewars. They're basically giant thermoses, and this is where the patients are stored. I would say this does not seem like a nice and inviting place to spend an indefinite future, so this is a real opportunity for UX designers in the future to innovate or to create better, better patient experiences in this space. Now, you may be surprised to hear that there is a rival technology to cryonics that also promises long-term human storage, and that is brain plastination. So early in my career, I worked with a team of scientists and futurists to establish an innovation prize to jumpstart basic research into new medical protocols for preserving brain tissue after death using plastic resins. So rather than freezing the brain, a plastination service would turn the brain into a perfectly preserved and shelf-stable lump of plastic. So the trade-off is that you can't thaw out plastic in the future. So what good would turning your brain into plastic be? I think is probably the question you have. So I could describe the process and what the value would be in greater detail, but luckily, our work at the Brain Preservation Foundation was covered by Morgan Freeman on his television show Through the Wormhole, and since he's just a better narrator than I am, I will let him do some of the talking here.
Now, what I'm saying is that neuroscience has told us that we, in essence, are digital information stored in the synaptic connections within our brain. If we preserve that brain at our death, then that information that makes us unique, all of those memories, they're not lost. And they can be potentially brought back just the same way digital information can be brought back by putting it in a new computer.
Software is physically written onto a hard drive. Make an exact copy of a drive and you have an exact copy of the information it contains. Ken believes all the information in your brain can also be copied and stored. All you have to do to preserve the connectome's trillions of neural connections is to copy the brain's hardware, one slice at a time. Ken's brain scanning assembly line would work like this. At the moment of death, the brain is extracted and preserved in plastic. The brain is then chopped by a heated diamond knife into 20-micron cubes, 40,000 times thinner than a human hair. These tiny slices are sliced again, 1,000 times thinner, then scanned by ion beams. The process is repeated millions of times until the entire brain is digitized.
It is technology that exists today. We map small bits of neural tissue at this ultimate resolution already.
The resolution is so high that we can not only see the connections between neurons, we can also determine their strength and type.
Once we have the ability to map a human brain, and once we have the knowledge of how that generates a human mind, we will be able to simulate that brain in a computer substrate and bring that individual back to life inside of a computer simulation.
Okay, so I mean, I love that video for many reasons. I think it's kind of funny, but it does a good job of explaining the end-to-end process of plastination through imaging and uploading. And just as a sidebar, that fellow speaking there was Ken Hayworth, the president of the Brain Preservation Foundation, and a brilliant electron microscopist at the time he was working at Harvard. So the work of the brain preservation was focused on the very first bit of that conveyor belt. And apologies for the squeamish among you, but that very first bit of the conveyor belt where Morgan Freeman says, the brain is extracted and preserved in plastic. So what we did at the Brain Preservation Foundation was we incentivized teams of scientists and engineers around the world through an innovation prize to invent a plastic resin and what we call a perfusion procedure, so a way of getting that plastic resin through the human vasculature into the brain so that it could turn the brain into plastic from the outside in. Okay, so that's a look at the space of radical life extension, at least in terms of these preservation technologies. But I do think that this question of whether you'd rather be flash frozen or stored in a giant thermos or turned into plastic and chopped into millions of tiny pieces, neither of those sound particularly pleasing or interesting from the perspective of the present, except for a vanishingly small number of people who are invested in this science and technology. So I think that there are a lot of challenges to solve in this space, not just on the technical side. There are many technical challenges to solve. Scaling is the biggest one, scaling this technology, but also major challenges in the social, cultural, and political spheres that surround life extension, radical life extension. So when we were working on this project back in around 2010, something that we were all closely monitoring at BPF was the development of the right to die movement. Back then, there were very few places in the world that offered medical assistance in dying. Switzerland was the big one at the time. And the reason we were interested in that emerging societal conversation was that the right to die movement was slowly eroding the taboos that surrounded people's freedom of choice when it came to deciding on the particulars of their death. And our thinking was that allowing for more agency in end-of-life services would also loosen the taboos against radical life extension. So politically, morally, and legally, the right to die would pave the way for the right to live indefinitely. This is kind of really interesting interface between those two conversations. So that was almost 15 years ago. And I think today people are becoming more intentional about designing their end-of-life experiences. I live in Canada, and we now have a program called MAID, Medical Assistance in Dying, which has been up and running for several years now. And people who are terminally ill are increasingly availing themselves of the service. And there's also a kind of a conversation around, that we have the option to end our lives in the way that we want. We can also design the end of life experience in the way that we want. This is an ad from the Canadian retailer Simons, and it shows a woman who has decided to have a sort of end of life art party. All of her friends come to and celebrate her in her final days. Really touching ad if you can see it with the narration on. So I think this we're extending the conversation into more thoughtfulness around how we design the end of life, and I think it also will spill into radical life extension. And over the coming decades, we'll find an equilibrium on the right to die, and you'll see a lot of design and innovation in this space. And again, I think it will also bear out for radical life extension. So the lesson here that I took from that episode at the Brain Preservation Foundation is that if you're working with emerging technologies, you really need to watch the culture closely. Timing is everything, and once again, being too early is as bad as being too late. And so if you're working on a technology that is provocative, or that it might frighten people, or that they might have misgivings about it, you need to find cultural inroads. You need to find ways to connect the conversation you're trying to have to a conversation that people understand. So it's essential for you to become a culture watcher if you're working in emerging technologies. Okay, so on to the next case study. After working in radical life extension back in 2010, I felt, I didn't really get a chance to see the immediate impact of my work. I mean, we did make progress on the science and the technical side of preservation technology, but there's still very little development in the consumer market for preservation technologies, because again, there are lots of problems that we still need to solve. So for my next emerging technology adventure, I wanted to find something that was boundary pushing, but that I could ship to market in a reasonable time frame. And because I was interested in brains, I decided to focus in the space of neurotechnology. So at the time, back in 2010, there was this great Toronto-based company called Interaxon, and they were building these great interactive experiences for brands and organizations using what they were calling, at the time, thought-controlled computing. So this is a video here of the two founders, Ariel Garten, the woman with the sunglasses, and Chris Imany in the pink shirt. And they're taking Steve Wozniak, so Steve is the co-founder of Apple. They're taking Steve through an experience at the 2010 Vancouver Olympics where you could put on a thought-controlled computing headset and you could control the lights on the CN Tower, the Canadian Parliament buildings, and Niagara Falls, which for those of you who might not be familiar with Canadian geography, they're all the way across the country. You could control the lights on those structures and those features from all the way across the country in Vancouver using your mind. So that's the experience that Steve is having right now. And I like the look on his face there. So I saw that, and this is before I worked for the company, and I thought, wow, that's really cool. I'd love to work with these guys. So just to tell you a little bit about what this technology is, EEG stands for electroencephalography. What you're seeing here is a raw data output of brainwaves. So this is somebody who's hooked up to an electroencephalograph, and the graph or the EEG is reading their brain signatures. Okay. So how does EEG work? It works by measuring electrical activity in the brain through sensors that are just placed on your scalp. These sensors detect tiny electrical charges that result from the activity of the brain cells, of your brain cells. And these signals are then amplified and recorded, and it provides a graphical representation of brainwave patterns. And as it turns out, different brain states are associated with different brainwave patterns. So if you are focused, that will look like something on an EEG. If you're distracted, it'll look like something else. Being calm has its own signature, as does being agitated. So in medical settings, and this was primarily EEG is developed as a medical technology, it's used for diagnostics. So we might hook you up to an EEG to test you for things like seizure disorders. It's also just for routine patient monitoring. So in the same way that you would monitor somebody's heart with an ECG, an electrocardiogram, you could monitor somebody's brain with an EEG. But then there are other use cases that are not just about passive monitoring, but about sort of actively using the brain waves in order to accomplish certain things. So Interaxon, in their interactive design installation for the Vancouver Olympics, they were using EEG as a controller to software. So if you made your brain calm, it would cause a computer, it would cause a software piece of software to flip into a specific state. So it would say, like if you're calm, we're going to turn the lights on the CN Tower blue, for instance. So that's what we mean by thought-controlled computing. The last use case is what we call biofeedback. So if you show people the results of their brain states, they can learn to control their mind more intentionally and enter into those states more easily. So we call that biofeedback. And instead of showing people the raw output of an EEG, we might show them a flower. And the more focused and calm they are, the more that the flower stands up and looks alive, and maybe the more distracted distracted they are, the more that the flower tends to wilt. And then over time, they learn how to intentionally enter into more calm and focused states. So when I joined the company, this is the CEO, Ariel Garten here. I was a little disappointed on the first day when Ariel said, well, we're kind of pivoting the company away from interaction design, doing these installations for brands. We're going to become a hardware and a product company. And what they wanted, this was literally on my first day. So they said, we want to build the first EEG headset that's designed from the ground up for the consumer market that can teach people meditation through biofeedback protocols. And this headband that Ariel is wearing here, which doesn't really look like, it looks pretty unassuming. This is the first headband that we produced, which we called Muse. So this is Muse Mark 1. Most EEG headsets at that time looked more like this. So these are research grade headsets. This means that they were built to be able to monitor pretty much the entire brain at once. These headsets were not very comfortable, as you can imagine. They were also very difficult to put on. It required somebody who had a lot of technical knowledge to calibrate them. And they often require the use of conductive gel that you would put beneath the sensors to improve the readings. So you could see that this woman is wearing this kind of cap, and the sensors are running all across the top of her head in her hair. So you need to put conductive gel on the sensors, and it would get into her hair. But that would be the only way you could get electrical impulses from the scalp to read onto the sensors. So this is not for everyday use. I think you can understand. Most of them were also wired, meaning that the headsets would have to be physically tethered to a computer. And they also had large battery packs because in order to power all these sensors, you needed a significant battery draw. So not user-friendly. We wanted the Muse to be as simple as possible. We wanted only as many sensors as we needed to get it to do what we wanted to do. And as it turns out, that is 4 sensors, which were right across the front of the forehead, underneath, or just above the brow. We wanted it to be wireless. We wanted it to be easy to use, like it's a one button to turn it on and to pair it. We wanted it to be as comfortable and unobtrusive as possible. And really, we didn't want it to feel like technology. We wanted it to feel more like a piece of your regular everyday sort of gear. That's also why we went with the name Muse. We considered a lot of names that foregrounded the technology, but ultimately we wanted to foreground the kind of friendly and magical quality of the device. So those are some of the considerations for the initial design of the headset. And what we were trying to do in that is strip away all the technology and find the warmth in this new consumer product. I also just want to reiterate, people were afraid. We would get questions from people that we tested this technology with. They would say, "Is it doing something to my brain? Can it read my thoughts? Is it going to hurt?" And so we had a lot of myth to dispel or fears to dispel. And the last thing that we wanted was the look and feel of the technology to be playing into those negative reactions. So we needed it to be friendly. We needed it to be warm. That was really what we were aiming for. I also want to quickly highlight, and you can see again, here are the 3 founders. And in this video, they're playing with a bunch of these prototypes. We went through a bunch of different form factors before we decided on the final look and feel of Muse. When we were playing with these form factors, we tried them again on hundreds of people. We just wanted to see how they would react to each of these different versions. And ultimately, we decided on the headband because people knew how to use it intuitively. It seemed like they were not confused by it and so on. Even though initially we were kind of married to this idea that it would be almost looks like something out of Star Trek. It'd be funky and asymmetrical. That's because we were all science fiction nerds. That was kind of our prejudice stepping in. But the other thing I want to highlight about this video is even though we were working with this kind of, seemingly magical technology, these prototypes were all made with things that we found in an art supply store down the street from the office. We went on a big shopping spree and bought a bunch of this stuff, brought it back to the office, and built these prototypes out of just all that stuff. They're non-functional. So even though you're working with fancy emerging technology, doesn't mean you need to use that in every part of the testing. You can really still go lo-fi. Just wanted to highlight that. So once we had the Muse Mark 1 ready to go, we took it to the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. This was in 2011. And we took hundreds of people through this meditation experience on the floor of CES where they would wear the Muse. And this video screen on the right, they'd be able to control the birds in the sky and the bubbles coming out of that little ship. Like the more they focused, the more bubbles they would produce and the birds would fly and so on. And it's just a wonderful kind of proof of concept, I think, for people. But what we discovered when we did all of these experiences is that there was a non-negligible number of people for whom we simply could not get the headset to work. And it was a mystery because when we tried it on ourselves and our friends and family around the Interaxon office, it was pretty much fail-safe that we get the experience to work every time. So why wasn't it working for, I don't know, maybe about like 5 to 10% of the people that we were trying it on? Well, as it turns out, our group of friends and family were not really representative of the entirety of the human race. And so when we started to try it on hundreds of people, we discovered that our design, the design of the headset, meant that people who had foreheads that were shaped somewhat differently, and often case foreheads that were a little bit more vaulted, or that had hairlines that started quite low, maybe almost met their brow, we would simply not be able to get good readings because the sensors that we used were rigid. They were stainless steel diodes, and so they were not flexible. And if a person's head was a little bit shaped a little bit more pointy, the sensors would float and not make good contact. So what this meant was we had to go away and redesign the headset from the ground up. It added an entire year to our ship date. We needed to find suppliers that could give us flexible conductive material so that it could mold, the sensors could mold to a person's head, and we could get a good connection every single time. And that required us to do a lot of backtracking. So the lesson there for me, especially in emerging technology, is you need to test relentlessly. We made an assumption that because we got this thing to work on ourselves and our friends and family, that it was ready for prime time. And thank goodness we brought it to CES and did this sort of trial run, because we found a fatal flaw in a product. There's no way that you could ever ship a product that had a 5 to 10% fail rate, that people would not be able to make it work. So this was a real blessing for us to discover that. And the only way we did to discover that is because we just continued to test, even after we thought we tested enough. And that's the only way we discovered this flaw in our design. So today, Muse has gone through several iterations. So this is what it looks like today. It's called the Muse S. It has onboard EEG. It also has heart rate and circulation monitoring, and it's expanded its suite of service offerings into sleep monitoring. And to date, they've sold about 500,000 Muses, which I think is just a wonderful achievement. That to me, it means that there's at least 500,000 people in the world, maybe more if people are sharing the headset, who have a more calm and focused mind, who are more able to deal with the stressors in their lives because of the work that we did. So in there, you can see the soft touch sensors that replace the rigid diodes. So now, just to move it, and we just have a few minutes left here, and I want to have a conversation with all of you and get to see some of your faces. But I just want to briefly talk a little bit about some early, I suppose, impressions that I have of the AI space, and thinking about the user interface, the user interaction, the user experience of AI, and what we might be getting wrong straight out of the gate with how we're thinking about it. So of course, it's an incredible time to be working in AI, not just because there are incredible leaps and bounds seemingly every week in this space, but more specifically because I think we've really only just begun to uncover the real value of artificial intelligence. So we're in this strange moment when technologies like large language models and generative AI are having enormous impacts on our world, but we almost don't even know how to measure them yet. I almost think about AI not just as a new product or service, but as a new operating system for the digital world. Sorry. You've probably heard that we're moving from a world of platforms to a world of agents. And I think that that is true. I think ultimately we might not be interacting with platforms very much in the future. Platforms will mostly be accessed and used by artificial agents on our behalf, and the agents themselves will be the ones who we are interacting with. So that raises a bunch of questions. One of the major concerns in the world of AI, and this is a long-standing discussion that goes back decades, really, before the commercialization of this technology, was what is called the alignment problem. Okay, why am I showing you paper clips? I'll get to that in just a second. But the alignment problem can be stated like this. How can we ensure that AI acts in ways that align with complex and context-dependent human values? In other words, how can we be sure that AI understands human values? What happens when the objectives programmed into AI do not fully capture human ethics and intentions? And then finally, how do we manage the risk of AI acting in harmful or unintended ways due to misaligned goals? So note that this is not a worry about evil AI. This is a worry about well-intentioned AI that simply overshoots our expectations or is somehow exceeding the bounds of human values, ethics. And so the paper clipper is a classic thought experiment in the space of alignment. So let's imagine you have a big conference coming up and you're one of the organizers, and you have thousands of booklets that all need to be paper clipped. But you don't have any paper clips, but you do have an agent who is an artificial agent that can help you to solve problems. And you ask the agent, you're in a bit of a kerfuffle, and you say to the agent, I need as many paper clips as you can get. because I need to get all these booklets sorted out for 9 a.m. tomorrow. And the agent interprets your instruction literally. I need as many paper clips as you can get, and then it goes out, doesn't go to the office supply store, put in an order for an overnight shipment. It just starts to mine ore, it starts to create factories, and it turns the entire landscape of the earth into paperclip factories. And then it exhausts all of our resources, and it pollutes our environment, and then ends the human race. So that's the paperclipper, a version of the paperclipper fear, the paperclipper thought experiment. Okay, and I think that that's a legitimate fear. I do think it is important that we work on these alignment problems. It's critically important. I would also point out, though, that I think even in the current era of digital platforms, we have an alignment problem. Our digital platforms have not been well aligned with human values. Writers and thinkers like Shoshana Zuboff in her book Surveillance Capitalism, she does a great job of articulating this. Tristan Harris, a former Google engineer, you may have seen him in the documentary The Social Dilemma. They've both done a wonderful job of articulating a powerful criticism of the current digital world, in which platforms like Meta, Amazon, and Google, they really exploit people's personal data without explicit consent to sell ads and to manipulate our emotions and to color our judgment. And they monitor our actions, and they analyze it, and they package and sell our data really without our knowledge or consent. And ultimately, these practices are eroding our privacy and autonomy, and deranging our decision making, and are creating a deranged knowledge environment as well. Social media as well has had some profoundly negative effects. I don't think it's well aligned to human values. We have we live in a climate of greater political polarization and reduced social cohesion, I think, is a direct result of social media, which is really a paradoxical effect that a technology that was supposed to bring us closer together has socially isolated us and made us more distrustful of one another. I think that there's also compelling evidence to show that the rise of social media is the smoking gun that's linked to the rise of incidences of mental health issues and suicide, especially among young people. And the social scientist Jonathan Haidt has done some wonderful work articulating that position. So we do have an alignment problem in the digital world, and it's existed for quite a long time. And I think there is a growing legal, moral, and political pushback against the excesses of digital technology, and hopefully we can carry that momentum into the future, into a future where we are interacting more with AI and interacting more with agents. Now, I want to suggest a kind of maybe a provocative framing, because a lot of these theorists, what they'll say is the problem is that the platforms know too much about us. And I actually don't really think that that's true. I think that the problem is actually that they really know so little about us that they don't know us at all. In other words, they kind of treat us in this underdetermined and transactive way, because they don't really know the person behind the data. So what do I mean by that? Well, there's this wonderful framework that comes from the work of a personality psychologist named Dan P. McAdams, and he has a classic paper. The paper's called "What Does It Mean to Know a Person?" And he says, well, there's really three layers or three stages of getting to know a person. When you first meet somebody, imagine you're at a dinner party and you see them across the room. You can very quickly get a sense of some of their basic traits. These are maybe their behavioral patterns, their emotional tendencies, their thinking styles, the way they interact with others, and their habits. So very quickly you could tell from meeting somebody, are they sort of friendly or maybe standoffish? Are they funny, or are they a little bit more aloof? These are things you could size up very quickly. But that's not really what it means to know a person. Once you get to know a person a bit better, you start to understand what he calls their concerns. These are their goals, their values, motivations, the roles they play in their lives, their coping strategies, and their interpersonal strategies. And then finally, your nearest and dearest, what do you understand about them? Well, you understand their life story, what the experiences that define them, their personal ideology, what gets them up in the morning. What are their significant relationships? What do they hope for, and what do they fear? And what is their concept of themselves? So the digital platforms don't really understand any of this. You know, imagine somebody who's struggling with alcohol, a substance abuse disorder, and maybe they've been searching for treatment facilities, and using the word alcohol in a search, they get returns for alcohol sales. Now, Google in particular has gotten wise to this, and they have put in protections that people can opt out of getting ads for things like alcohol. So there is progress in this space, but it's still based on this sort of fundamental misunderstanding of our broader identity and our broader set of concerns. Now, I also think we're in a strange place where a lot of us don't really understand these things about ourselves either, because we spend so much time online in these very sort of shallow interactions, and not really having time to reflect and to better understand ourselves, that we're kind of disconnected from ourselves as well in some ways. So my sort of design challenge to people working in AI is, how can we actually use AI to better reconnect us to ourselves, to help us ourselves see ourselves more clearly, understand who we are, how others see us, how we fit into the world around us. And I think that there's a potential future here in which, rather than exploiting our data, AI can help us to sort of, again, better understand ourselves, and ultimately help to increase our subjective well-being and be advocates for us in the digital space, rather than just another layer that tries to shake us down and to get us to do things that it wants us to do. So that's my hope for the AI space. I know it might be a little bit utopian, but there are people working in this space trying to develop humanizing AI, and AI that understands not just our traits, but also our concerns and our life stories. And I'm proud to say that I've been working with companies doing that exploration. I'd love to tell you about them in the future, but currently most of them are working in stealth. So the last lesson I want to leave you with is that you really got to build for the next world. Building AI based on the playbook that the digital platforms have established over the past 20 years is not going to get us to that new world. We need to reset our assumptions and shoot for something different. So I just want to, again, close in the last minute or so by reiterating the importance of the role of user experience design in the adoption of emerging technologies. I think that the natural fear and hesitancy of the unknown is always going to be with us. But sadly, it can keep people from enjoying the value that new technologies can bring to their lives. So in the cases I described here, it could mean that, if somebody was afraid of life extension technologies, maybe they get fewer healthy years of their lives. If they're afraid of thought-controlled computing, or as we eventually called it, brain sensing technology, maybe they miss out on having a calmer and more focused mind, or one that they can control the distraction and anxiety that they feel, right? Maybe if people are afraid of artificial intelligence in the future, they might miss out on a life that has a deeper sense of connection to their purpose, and more self-awareness, and more intention and purpose in their lives. So especially in a future where technology is fundamentally redefining what it means to be human, I see it as a moral and ethical calling for UX designers to work in emerging technology, because I think it's a place that they can make enormous impacts in people's lives. So in closing, and just to reiterate, go off-road mapping, watch the culture for change, find the warmth in these emerging technologies. There's so much work to be done to make them more consumer-friendly and warm. Make sure you test relentlessly, because these are new technologies that in most cases, or in many cases, that have not reached markets. You need to test thoroughly. And finally, build for the next world, and not the one that we are growing out of. So with that, I'll close out, and thanks very much for listening, and I'd love to have a conversation.